Welcome everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to this final session of Positive Energy's virtual conference on the roles and responsibilities of public authorities in energy decision-making in an age of climate change. I am so pleased you can join us. We have a terrific audience of leaders from the energy and environmental communities. My name is Marisa Beck and I'm the Research Director for Positive Energy. I'm standing in today for Positive Energy's chair, Monica Gettinger, who had an urgent family matter to attend to, and she sends her regrets. For those who aren't familiar with the Positive Energy Initiative, we are a research and engagement program based at the University of Ottawa. Our mandate is to identify how to strengthen public confidence in energy decision-making. We pursue this mandate in two ways. First, by using the convening power of the university to bring together emerging and established leaders from the business, government, indigenous, ENGO, and academic communities to identify the challenges that we're facing. And second, by conducting solution-focused applied academic research. The Positive Energy team comprises of over a dozen researchers. I would like to begin our session today with a land acknowledgement. I encourage you to acknowledge the land from which you are joining us. This land acknowledgement is especially meaningful as we mourn the lives this week of the 215 children whose remains were found at a former Indian residential school in British Columbia. Our hearts are with the children, the families, the survivors, and all those damaged by the Indian residential school system. We pay our respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Again, I would encourage you to acknowledge the land from which you are joining us today. Today is the final lunch hour session profiling positive energy research on public confidence and the roles and responsibilities of public authorities in energy decision-making. Who decides what, when, and how for energy and climate decisions, whether they are policy decisions, regulatory decisions, project decisions, is crucial. There are multiple public authorities involved in decision-making: policymakers, regulators, the courts, indigenous governments, municipal governments, federal, provincial, territorial governments. For Canada, an energy-intense economy with a large resource base, having decision-making arrangement for the country's energy and climate future that secure the confidence of citizens, customers, communities, investors, and government themselves is crucial. It will shape how well the country will succeed on both energy and climate, all the more so on the road to net zero emissions by 2050. When it comes to net zero, policy debates often overlook the institutional arrangements that will be needed to reduce emissions in the real world of politics, intergovernmental relations, consumers, energy markets, investors, citizens, and community preferences. Positive Energy's work on research on roles and responsibilities is intended to fill that gap. On the first day of the conference, Nick Nanos presented new Positive Energy survey findings about public confidence in energy and climate decision-making. The results underscored that there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to strengthening Canadians' trust in decision-making. Tuesday's sessions focused on how to strengthen public confidence in policymakers and regulators, both of which are making crucial decisions about Canada's energy future. And we heard about the research studies undertaken by Mike Cleland and Roland Harrison on regulatory independence and the cabinet's role in energy decisions. The key message here: we will need to continuously reform our regulatory systems to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. Yesterday's session, the focus was on federalism, and we heard presentations from Dwayne Brad, Andrew Pickford, and Cameron Cross, along with comments from CAP's Shannon Joseph. The session underscored the importance of working to align federal and provincial visions, seizing opportunities to collaborate when windows to do so open up, and the need for robust policy discussions about Canada's energy future on the road to net zero, notably the role of oil and gas in that future and the importance of aligning market and regulatory tools to secure the investment that will be needed to transform the energy economy. So in today's session, our focus is on new imperatives in policy and regulatory decision-making. We're going to be looking at how policymakers and regulators are innovating in the face of new technologies, increasing expectations for public engagement, and growing needs for policymakers and regulators to connect with one another. Dr. Patricia Larkin, a senior research associate with Positive Energy, has undertaken a terrific study with us in collaboration with Campit, Canada's energy and utility regulators. And that study focused on regulatory innovations in public engagement and policy regulatory relations. James Donald, also with us today, is a doctoral candidate at the University of Victoria and a member of the Positive Energy research team. And he's working on a study with Positive Energy faculty affiliate Professor Bryson James from Oregon State University that examines the influence of new and emerging technologies on regulators and policymakers. Our discussant for today is Robert Hornung, CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, and also a member of Positive Energy's Advisory Council. But to kick off the session, we're going to hear from Canada's regulators. We are showing pre-recorded video remarks from a number of regulatory leaders in Canada. And we asked them to identify the one key imperative of net zero emissions by 2050 for regulators. Following that, we will hear the presentations from Patricia and James, and then proceed to the comments from Robert. And this will be followed by Q&A. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose questions. If you would like your name to be mentioned, please let me know, and I'll be happy to do that. And please feel absolutely free to ask questions during the presentation portion of the event already. I won't interrupt our speakers, but I will do my best to get to all the questions at the end of the session. But for now, let's get started with those regulatory videos. Raphael, if you could load them up, please. Thank you.
For me, the one key imperative for Canadian regulators during a time of transition to a low carbon economy comes down to this: building public trust. We must be more than prudent regulators. We must be trusted and recognized for enabling growing and shifting economies and improving the quality of life for the people we serve, who deserve safe, reliable, and affordable energy. The energy transition is real. Public policy has moved from the why to the how. As energy regulators, we may not have driven the why, but we must envision and inform the how. And we must work in partnership with those we regulate in the interest of the customers we collectively serve. In working toward net zero emissions, we succeed or fail together, regardless of our respective mandates. And it starts and ends with building public trust. Thank you.
One imperative for Canada's energy regulators as we move to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Well, in a word, data. Utilities, customers, and service providers are increasingly using data to assess and improve performance and identify new opportunities. And regulators are going to need to do that as well. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other advanced analytical tools are helping to unlock key insights from data. And as we work to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, there's going to be tremendous change in the sector. And regulators are going to have a significant influence on the success of that transition. So, as regulators want to continue to ensure effective and efficient regulation and really ensure the best possible outcomes for customers through the transition, they'll be well served by harnessing the potential of data through these new analytical tools. Regulators will also want to ensure that data is available as much as possible to customers and to the sector generally. This needs to be done in a way that protects privacy, but data is going to be so important to facilitating innovation. And it's that innovation that's going to help with the transition. Thank you.
Key imperative for Canadian energy regulators as Canada moves to achieve net zero emissions in 2050 is to continue to apply and promote the fundamentals of good regulation in the face of rapid technological and policy changes. This does not mean that concepts such as cost of service rate making must be upheld and indiscriminately applied if they no longer make sense. However, it recognizes there will continue to be a need to ensure services affected with a public interest are efficient, effective, economic, and equitable. Although the need to decarbonize in a rapidly closing window will likely mean tomorrow's energy sector will look different than it does today, the fundamentals of good regulation will guide future regulators just as they do today. The application of these fundamentals will continue to inform what should be regulated and how. Beyond applying them, regulators must also be willing to share their expertise to provide policymakers with the benefit of context and options as those individuals grapple with managing the broad social, political, and economic implications of climate change. We need to have informed and honest conversations with utilities, customers, stakeholders, and policymakers about what the transition to our future looks like and what it will cost. And I believe we need to insist on policy clarity to avoid unintended and costly consequences. I look forward to today's discussion.
Wow, these comments from regulatory leaders in Canada have, I think, given some good inspiration and good ideas to start into today's discussion. So I'm going to be handing over to Patricia Larkin for her presentation. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you very much for having me today. I just have 2 steps here to get ready. Okay, so here we go. Like I said, I'm glad to be here, and I won't go over the basis of this project with CAMPUT because Marisa mentioned that earlier. So there were 2 steps to this research and engagement. And first, I must say we focused on quasi-judicial energy regulators and not line department regulators in this study. The survey component was completed by about 50 people: regulators, policymaking authorities, utilities, representatives, environmental and other non-government organizations, large and small customers, indigenous organizations, law firms, and universities. They were asked to rate the relative importance of broad drivers of innovation, as well as those more particular to policymaker-regulator interactions and the regulator-public engagement. They were also asked to suggest innovative practices. Secondly, we turned to case study research and conducted interviews with about 25 senior executives, again, representing those types of organizations that create, implement, use, or are affected by innovations in these 2 areas. And so the first research question, as you can see, is how might formal policymaker-regulator interactions be strengthened while maintaining regulatory independence? And these 5 agreements came from across Canada, in British Columbia, Alberta, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and the NEB. In regulator public engagement, the research question was what innovative mechanisms support meaningful regulator engagement? And here we looked at processes related to distributed energy resources, a formal inquiry that was completed at the Alberta Utilities Commission, and an informal consultation at the Ontario Energy Board. The participants identified benefits and barriers to development and implementation and proposed factors of success in these areas. And in the report, we then propose a series of questions, essentially a tool regulators might ask to assess or promote progress. So I have one slide here to indicate the responses to the relative importance of broad drivers. And while the top driver is evolving social and environmental goals and values, with respect to Peter's comment to respond to rapid technological change, you can see that this was rated highly very highly when both very important and important ratings are combined. Also, I want to mention that the most important driver for policymaker regulator interactions was for clear articulation of policy goals that drive regulation. And with respect to Susanna's key imperative, public trust in energy decision-making, this was indeed rated the top driver across all regions and sectors for innovation in public engagement. So in turning to the findings, in the formal agreements, we found clearly articulated benefits and barriers to their development and use. I'm just going to talk about the benefits today. With respect to Susanna's issue of trust, this actually came up in this case as well, and maybe some of us think trust is related to public engagement. The discussions and negotiation during the development of an agreement might very well improve trust. While such activities take time, case study findings strongly suggest this is time well spent. With respect to the fourth bullet, stakeholder interests as a benefit, the interactions do have a potential positive effect if both authorities demonstrate an equal commitment to transparency and building trust through the engagement process. And this will come up again in the second case summary. Of note, the identified success factors concern each party individually as well as the two organizations working together. So in turning to some of the findings and those questions I mentioned as a tool regulators could use, we did come up with about 35 questions. Of course, there isn't time today, but I did pick a couple here that reflect the key imperatives of the videotape presentations. Peter's imperative for strong fundamentals included policy clarity and to provide opportunities for regulators to share expertise and promote collaboration and cooperation. So in terms of the role of senior executives, regulators could ask, does the leadership culture support increased collaboration and cooperation within the legislative mandates? In terms of intention, under a formal agreement, can we move further along the interaction continuum? For example, from information sharing and coordination to substantive policy issues. In terms of understanding priorities, do we know or what is the long-term policy objective for the energy market system? This is also an issue important to regulator public engagement. And last, on clear roles and responsibilities, importantly for this question around the achieving net zero by 2050 in the next 30 years, what will be the impact of leadership and or government change? And now, in terms of the public engagement case and the two consultation processes, yes, the participants identified benefits and barriers, but here the reporting is describing them more as trade-offs. And so number one, the benefit of an open process raised concern about uncertainty and long timelines. Two, the benefit of taking a systems-based perspective raised concern about reduced clarity for the purpose of the process. And three, the benefit of having diverse participants raised concern about their capacity and resources. On point 1 and 2, on a positive note, free-flowing information in both provinces helped the overall discussion and encouraged confidence and trust among the broad range of interveners. On point 3, and this relates to Cynthia's imperative for availability and use of data, I want to add that Positive Energy has also identified the availability of adequate, reliable, accessible, and trusted information as a key principle of informed reform. Relatedly, transparency in the dissemination among government and non-government stakeholders is, of course, important. So on point 3, while all participants were given the same opportunity to present, comment, submit information, and even feel heard, although some have an innately louder voice, some interviewees indicated feeling disadvantaged in these terms. As an example, there were over 700 documents on the e-filing portal in Alberta, And so there is a concern for capacity to participate. And I'm going to close with a few questions, again, in 4 categories, actually, for public engagement case. By definition, public engagement is the opportunity for communication and exchange and collaboration and cooperation. But with respect to process, in terms of providing a vision, what might the regulator could ask? What is the policy related purpose? And is this clear to the stakeholders? With respect to content, picking up on data to encourage openness and transparency, does the regulator have an internal policy in these matters? In terms of diversity, of course, reflecting trust and strong fundamentals in the regulator's business, are Indigenous groups and policymakers invited and involved? You may wonder why policymakers should be included in regulatory consultation. Well, besides creating the regulatory framework, stakeholders would then be heard firsthand, possibly averting a prolonged second consultation should the policymaker decide that a new or revised approach would be in the public interest. Finally, on reporting to demonstrate how information is used or not, and this is a bit of a sideline to what Cynthia said on the data imperative, but does reporting include what was heard and how participants' input is being addressed or not? So I want to thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you so much. So much fascinating information in here. We should mention that some of Patricia's research findings are already available on the Positive Energy website. The full final report of the project will be published shortly. Without further ado, I'm handing over to James for his research presentation. James, over to you.
Thanks, Marisa. Hello, everyone from British Columbia. Very happy to be here presenting today. Okay, so piece of work that I'm presenting on today is looking at the influence of new and emerging energy technologies and how they may change the role of public authorities and also how the way in which the public interacts with those authorities. So this is an ongoing piece of work at the moment. So what I'm presenting today here are only preliminary findings at this stage. But in particular, what we're trying to get at here is the role of public authorities, policymakers at different levels of government, and also regulators, how the new and emerging energy technologies may change their roles and what implications there might be for their decision-making abilities and their ability to deliver on emissions reductions. So the context for this research was the strong push for energy decarbonization, particularly at the level of municipal governments, many of whom have set ambitious targets around being 100% renewable or zero emissions targets, those sorts of things. The rapid technological development that's happening in areas that could impact the energy sector directly, energy technologies, or indirectly through other types of technologies. Excuse me. And also the potential for emerging technologies to alter the structure and the scale of the traditional utility supplier, household consumer model that has existed to date. The data collection for this piece of work revolved around a set of interviews, semi-structured interviews, which were conducted last year in the spring and summer. Participants were selected based on their professional expertise in the area of energy decision-making. 10 interviews were completed, predominantly in British Columbia, with 1 in Alberta. And interview topics were sent to the interviews in advance, so they had time to prepare their responses. And you can see the breakdown of interviewees was split between provincial government representatives, municipal government representatives, regulators, and representatives from utilities. But the focus here in terms of this presentation is the regulators. So there are a number of technologies you can see on the screen there that were mentioned in the interviews. I think there's an overriding theme that technology was seen by all decision makers of all types as very important for delivering emissions reductions. But there was some disagreement and perhaps ambiguity around what exactly constitutes a technology. It was left to the interviewee to decide how they would define what a new or emerging energy technology was. And that led to a significant range in the technologies that were mentioned, and some debate over whether something such as improved infrastructure and planning, for instance, was really a technology in its own right. So there was some ambiguity there, as I said. In addition, for a number of the interviewees, these technologies that they were talking about, they didn't really consider them to be new necessarily, but their widespread adoption was something that was new for people. An example of this would be something like electric vehicles or heat pumps, where the technology has been around for a few years, but the rate of adoption is increasing rapidly. And I think in the three categories I've got here, which is the provincial scale technologies, large scale things like use of hydrogen, nuclear energy, renewable natural gas, or carbon capture. The second category of community and household scale technologies, which includes the ones I mentioned, like electric vehicles and heat pumps. And that's the category where there seemed to be the most rapid adoption happening in terms of the increase in the use of these technologies. There were also some other technologies mentioned which could have a bearing on the energy system, but we're perhaps much further in the future at this stage and much less clear how they would influence the system. There were also some themes which came out of the interviews, which were sort of underpinning the discussion on technologies. Electrification was a big theme, the role of electricity, and electrification was dominant in the interviews, as was discussion on energy storage and the need for energy storage. But other themes that came through of interest as well were equity and cost. That's both the additional cost of the technologies needed to reduce emissions, and also how those costs would be borne across society. Who would be funding the adoption or the rollout of these technologies? How did that break down across society? Those were seen as key issues. So given the range of technologies identified, I've tried to develop three possible types of scenario for how they might potentially affect the energy system and the role of regulators in different types of ways. And these three scenarios are for example purposes, really. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive either, so they may all be pursued to different extents. So I'll just run through what those are. So the first one revolved around the large-scale provincial types of technologies. So the use of hydrogen, large-scale carbon capture, or possibly large storage of some form. Those technologies were seen to be things that could effectively replace current fossil fuels and therefore continue or allow us to continue with the traditional utility consumer model of the energy system. However, some adaptation will be needed in order to be able to regulate new types of services such as storage and carbon capture. So perhaps in this scenario, there might be fairly limited change for regulators. The next scenario I've used solar PV as an example. All of these technologies are just examples of types of technologies that I feel may alter the energy system in similar kinds of ways. So solar PV is something that we've seen can be rolled out at a very small scale. It can be at a household scale, it can also be at a community scale. So we're looking at a model which revolves more around micro and distributed generation. And this could lead for the regulators could lead to a rise in the non-regulated sector of the energy system and potentially a falling rate base for the existing system. Those are challenges, and those could lead to a significant potential for change for regulators, either stepping into having to regulate at a very small scale, or perhaps dealing with this issue of a falling rate base and who picks up the costs of that for the existing system. And then the third scenario is based more around the, let's say, the demand side or the household scale types of technologies, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and small scale battery storage. This could lead very much to the prosumer or producer consumer model, where individuals or aggregations of households potentially are acting both as producers and consumers of energy at the same time. And this would be quite a radical change potentially in the way the system works, and also in the way its decisions over it are governed and how it's regulated. And this may lead to some kind of a remaking of the role of public authorities. It's quite unclear how that would play out, but it has the potential for being radical change. And so just to finish off, some very preliminary findings. As I said, this work is still ongoing, but it's clear that there's many technologies that have a potential role in reducing energy emissions, and not all of them are necessarily new technologies, but their adoption may be new. But the development and adoption rate of these technologies will influence how the future role of the regulator and other policymakers changes. But the nature and the extent of that change is unclear currently. And as a last thought, it would appear that demand-side technologies have possibly the greatest potential to disrupt the energy system and to change the role of regulators. Thank you very much for presenting. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, James, for your remarks today. This is a truly fascinating research project, and I'm very pleased to hand it over to our discussant today, Robert Hornung, who will give his perspective really from the position of a practitioner. So Robert, you have longstanding experience working closely with renewable energy companies, and we are really looking forward to hearing your views on some of the issues and challenges that Patricia and James have presented in their research. Over to you, Robert. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Marisa, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all. From my perspective, the move to net zero greenhouse gas emissions clearly represents a significant challenge for Canada, but it also represents a significant challenge for regulators. And that's in part driven by the fact that the energy transition we're talking about to get to net zero is unprecedented in terms of the scale of the change and transformation that's required and the speed with which it has to happen. And I actually see sessions like the one we're holding today as very important, and actually an acknowledgement and recognition that the current energy regulatory system is not actually structured in a way right now that will enable us to move smoothly towards net zero by 2050. There is going to be a need for some evolution, things that we can do better. And I think that was sort of highlighted in both the presentations we just saw and in some of the video remarks we saw earlier. So I've been asked to offer some reflections on this evolution, informed by the presentations we've had, but also, as Marisa said, from the perspective of a group of industries who see themselves as a key solutions provider to our climate change challenge. So from my perspective, I guess the first thing I would say is one key thing that all stakeholders, including regulators, need is policy clarity and policy certainty. And that was mentioned earlier in presentations. Of course, this has always been really challenging in the climate change space, not just because our goals are often vague or high level or ill-defined, but also that they're not commonly broadly shared amongst different governments, for example, and the fact that they can often change from government to government. And that's a real quandary for regulators to work with. And of course, defining those objectives is not the responsibility of the regulator. That's a policymaker's responsibility. If we have clearly defined objectives, then I think the regulator can focus on assessing what's the most cost-effective way for us to meet those objectives, how can we assure we're doing it in the fairest way to manage risk and cost, And how can we ensure that we're doing so in a way that continues to ensure that energy services are provided safely and reliably? You know, from that perspective, some of the case studies that Patricia was looking at in terms of agreements between policymakers and regulators, I do believe are really quite important. It's important for those agreements to develop a common understanding around policy objectives, and also to reach agreement on the respective roles and responsibilities of the different bodies. I think we still could imagine there's a lot of examples in Canada of areas where we can do more to enhance coordination, eliminate duplication, ensure that processes and timelines are complementary and not working against each other within different bodies. And I actually do think that real progress is being made in a number of these areas. And I think the case studies that Patricia highlighted sort of illustrate that. There's a lot of work going on to try and move that forward. Now, we're talking about this in the context of net zero, and there's clearly environmental pressures that are moving us forward. As James mentioned, there's also increasingly consumer pressures, citizen pressures, customer pressures for this transition to move forward. But it's also very much a product of technology disruption. The energy sector is going through a massive technological disruption, similar to what we've seen in other sectors across the economy. It's posed challenges for regulators and other sectors of the economy too, and it's going to do the same thing here. Given the speed, the rapidity of these changes and the extent of these technological evolutions, initiatives like the ones that Patricia highlighted in terms of distributed energy resources, in terms of bringing different stakeholders together outside a formal process around a specific project proposal or something like that, but bringing stakeholders together to learn jointly about these different changes, to discuss what are the potential implications of these changes for the energy system, for the key stakeholders within it, I think is absolutely critical. And it's important because it helps to create, as Patricia mentioned actually, trust and confidence in the process amongst all of the people participating within it. It also provides, or can provide, more of a common knowledge base for everyone working within the process and engaged in the issue. And at the same time, provide everybody with an overview and an understanding of the different range of perspectives that are at the table in terms of as we try and do this and go forward. So I think we need more of that, frankly, going forward. And you know, a number of people have mentioned the importance of data. And I think that is also incredibly critical. I mean, Canada is actually known as a laggard in terms of energy data. We're not necessarily very transparent in energy data. We now have tools, as was mentioned in one of the videos, through smart grid artificial intelligence to actually accumulate much more data. We need to do more to collect that data, share that data, be transparent about it, and analyze it, because that's going to inform solid decision-making going forward. Now, in the electricity sector, and sort of building on what James was talking about, the implications of these technology changes are quite profound. You know, James talked about the sort of, here are three scenarios. I would argue the first scenario, where the role of the regulator changes very little, is by far the least likely scenario in terms of where technology is going to drive this stuff. And I think there's a broad consensus that the electricity system of the future is going to look incredibly different from the electricity system of today. It's going to be much more decentralized. It's going to be much more customer driven, the prosumer that James talked about. It's going to be much more digitalized, and it's going to be much more integrated. And the technologies that are going to do the biggest disruption are the technologies that are coming fastest. And that's another challenge for regulators in terms of, well, how do we do that? How do we deal with the fact that we've got now distributed energy resources, energy storage, microgrids, electric vehicles, all coming at the same time to fundamentally alter how our electricity system works? And, you know, outside of regulators, I mean, anybody who works in the electricity business is in the process of fundamentally revising or reviewing their business model and trying to figure out, what does my business model look like in that electricity system of the future? And utilities, for example, are going to have to really think about what is their role in that future system, because it's not what they do today. It might be part of that, but they're going to have to modify and adapt. And I think regulators have to do the same. And in fact, I think the disruption is so significant that, and James was hinting at this, it has implications for who are we actually regulating? What do we call a utility? Those sorts of questions are questions we're going to have to wrestle with in this new world that we're moving towards. The other item, of course, of getting to net zero is not just that these new technologies are coming into the electricity sector, it's that we're also going to become increasingly reliant on electricity. Any sort of study that looks at how do you get to net zero envisions that we're probably going to have to double electricity production because we're going to need that electricity to help us decarbonize other sectors like transportation, like buildings and industry. And that's going to require some significant new investments in generation and in infrastructure. And again, regulators are going to have an important role in ensuring that those investments proceed and move forward in a way that respects good regulatory principles and the objectives that the regulators are trying to achieve. And from that perspective, it's going to force a broadening of how we think about some of these things. Because all this technological disruption, while it's creating a more complex system, it's also creating a system which provides a lot more options for dealing with energy services. Whether it's the provision of energy itself, whether it's the provision of reliability, whether it's the provision of flexibility in the system. And more options provide more opportunities to reduce costs. And therefore, I think it's going to be imperative for regulators to, going forward, ensure that frameworks are established that recognize the diversity of options that are out there, clearly define the services that need to be provided, and ensure that we've got mechanisms in place that allow different service providers to be compensated for providing those services going forward. And it's going to be clear that for bodies that are regulated, that they are incented to ensure that they consider all options and all options equally and ultimately choose the most cost-effective ones. And a common example of this is we talk about, when we talk about investments in infrastructure, in the electricity sector, we traditionally think about, well, we need to build a bunch of transmission and we need to connect generation to load going forward. The new technologies are providing more options in that regard. Alternatives to transmission through non-wires alternatives, through the use of energy storage and other technologies. And we need to ensure that, again, regulated entities are considering those full range of options to ensure we get to the lowest cost solutions. We're going to need a mix of both of those things, but we can't just default to the way we've always done it. The technological disruption is providing us with new opportunities. We need to ensure that we're actually creating frameworks that allow us to explore and capitalize on those new opportunities. And that speaks to sort of grid modernization, innovation, also going to be key to reducing costs going forward. It's going to be increasingly important to ensure that innovation is encouraged and not discouraged. Given the size of the challenge we're trying to undertake here, we can't be risk averse. There are discussions around things like innovation sandboxes to have discussions around, well, how can we sort of tackle some of these issues and how can we incent innovation and provide the sort of impetus to do that. And we need to look at that very, very seriously. So I think overall, the challenge before us is very significant. But I honestly believe that addressing a challenge like getting to net zero is not primarily a technological challenge. We don't have all the technologies yet that get us there. There's work underway. We have to develop some technologies. But the bigger challenge, I think, is can we establish the policy frameworks, the market frameworks, the regulatory frameworks that actually allow us to capitalize on that technological innovation that's going on and allow us to deploy those technologies that will provide the solutions we require in the most cost-effective way possible. And that's not the responsibility of any single stakeholder. It's certainly not the responsibility of regulators on their own. We are only going to get there by working together. And we don't have a lot of time to do so. So I look forward to the discussion and appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Robert, for this really interesting perspective that you've presented here. And we do have some time for a bit of discussion among the speakers and also with our audience through Q&A. And I see the questions coming in. Please feel free to participate by typing your question in the Q&A box. I'll try to get to as many as possible. But first of all, I wanted to give Patricia and James a quick opportunity to maybe respond to Robert's comments. Patricia, do you have thoughts that you would like to share, having heard Robert's response?
Yes, thank you, Robert. I think we're on the same page. And what I was thinking about was, yes, we all need to pull in the same direction. And this includes the proponents, the utilities, the NGO and ENGO communities, Indigenous, consumers, everyone, and to find a sweet spot. And I wonder in the Canadian tradition if that this may not please everybody, but when we don't please everybody, that seems to be when maybe we get it right. And so that was my one thought. And my background's in risk management, and I'm thinking in this scenario, my second point is that we probably can't be afraid of making mistakes as we go along. It is a journey, and I think we'll some efforts in the policy and the market and the regulatory framework just may not fit after a few years, but we have to try.
Thank you, Patricia. James, excuse me, James, any comments from your side at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Marisa. Yeah, no, I agree with all of what you said. I think, Robert, I think the one response I would have is that I think you started off with talking about the need for policy clarity and certainty, and I think that's possibly something that can be achieved at a high level around aiming for a 2050 target or something like that. But I think it's much more difficult when it comes to trying to create policy around these many different new energy technologies. And I think the positive hope is that you can develop a system of governance and regulation that's flexible enough to accommodate whatever technologies progress at whatever rates they progress. But I think that's a major challenge. I don't think that's an easy thing to do in any way.
Yeah, lots of complexity here. And the questions that are coming in actually are focusing on some of these complexities. So I'm going to pick up a question from the audience here for all speakers. So a couple of questions have come in, and I'll summarize them in my own words about the changing role, especially for regulators, that is emerging from these technological changes and new imperatives coming from quite ambitious emission reduction targets. So one participant mentioned the traditional role of regulators was to protect customers from monopoly abuse and to ensure low cost for customers. And so there, with these new imperatives coming in, there might be really dual objectives or trade-offs between objectives. So reducing costs, reducing emissions. How can regulators really manage these sometimes what can I say, or these objectives that need to be traded off or need to be balanced? How can regulators address these objectives that might sometimes be at odds with each other? So I guess one point that was taken from previous responses, policy clarity around priorities would be very helpful. But are there other thoughts that our speakers can add to this question?
I could add a couple of things, Marisa. I just before I answer, the context of my work was predominantly in British Columbia, where it's a public-owned utility electricity system anyway. So that's possibly different in terms of a more free market system where monopoly abuse is perhaps more the focus of control. But I think the hope is with and as I hopefully touched on in my presentation, that there is the potential for much greater choice here for consumers, much greater choice in the ways in which they obtain their energy, I guess would be the way to do it, and the way that they control their own energy services. And I think that there's a hope there that would limit that choice would allow a market to develop, which would limit the possibility for monopoly abuse. However, I think there's a caveat to that it's not necessary, however the energy system is structured, it still relies on wires, and it still relies on probably on large scale connectivity, and therefore there are probably limitations to how that, the amount of choice that's really going to be available to people. Can you genuinely switch electricity provider every week, or is it actually quite challenging? So I think there is the potential there for the regulator to have to look at how different service providers are operating and whether they should or shouldn't be regulated. But on the upside, final comment on this is, I think the opportunity for regulators in terms of these technologies is to bring to bear the use of things like big data and other intelligent systems to try to help understand what's happening, possibly even in real time in the system, to allow them to manage that and control and protect customers.
Patricia, Robert, the comment?
Yeah, no, I would just, I don't have a lot to add to what James just said. I think he's absolutely right that the technological changes are opening up the door to more customer participation, more customer engagement, more competition. How that plays out in different markets will depend on a whole host of decisions. It is different in a market like Alberta than it is in British Columbia in terms of how that's going to roll going forward. But I have a feeling that even in provinces like British Columbia or provinces with large vertically integrated utilities at the moment, we will see evolution. There are going to be some elements that are clearly monopoly focused, I think, and that is the core infrastructure, the grid itself, and things like that. But I expect we will ultimately see more competition in generation, for example, and things like that. And already you do see, a number of crown utilities across the country who are looking to other producers to provide generation into the system and to do that sort of thing. And I think that's a trend that's only going to continue. And I think a lot of it is going to be driven by customers. Utilities have to respond to their customer base, and more customers are saying either we want to generate this type of power, or we want to have this kind of flexibility. And now they're increasingly finding there are tools available that would allow them to have that.
Great.
I might just add one idea around that. For the public engagement case, the feedback I heard was general satisfaction that those broader consultation processes weren't stuck, as they say, in usual rate making. And so as Robert also mentioned, those types of broader consultations would be an opportunity, at least initially, not on an ongoing basis, but to have these conversations on how to manage the priorities that you mentioned in the question.
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine another two questions. We have a lot coming in, so we won't be able to address them all. But there were a couple of questions around the speed of change that is necessary to meet emission targets. And as Robert said, it's not necessarily the speed of technological change, but it's the speed of a regulatory innovation, social political innovation that kind of needs to support that technological change. So to possibly speed up the process of regulatory innovation and the way that decision-making system is changing, learning, as one of our participants mentioned, could play a key role. And I'd be interested in your views from your research, and Robert, from your experience. Is there an exchange of experiences happening between different actors in the sector? Is kind of a collective learning process taking place so that different actors can benefit from what others have done? Patricia, I would assume your research actually is contributing to playing that role to become a learning platform for others. Maybe you can speak to that briefly.
Well, it did. And again, with respect to the public engagement, but I think another avenue I would give a shout out right now to the idea around innovation sandboxes and sort of dealing with the speed of change and having opportunities to have these conversations in the real world context of that Quest and Pollution Probe are undertaking right now.
Robert, what is your experience around these collective learning processes? Are you involved in initiatives like these?
Yeah, I mean, the two that Patricia studied as case studies, for example, on distributed energy resources, we were engaged in. And I do think we are seeing more of that. And it's interesting, I think there's two elements. There's one element which is involving bringing together all of the different stakeholders, right, to sort of have that discussion. So learning from each other that way, but there's also the opportunity to learn from each other across, for example, jurisdictions. Something which we do a bit of, but because of the way, you know, energy responsibilities are structured and because people are focused on their own particular market and their own particular requirements, I honestly think we don't do enough of that. And I think we, you know, we may all come up with different solutions for every part of the country because that's appropriate to the unique context. But I think we probably don't do enough at the front end to ensure that we're sort of all starting from a common knowledge base to try and tackle those questions. And I think we're sometimes too often trying to start to reinvent the wheel everywhere instead of sort of starting together and then diversifying as is appropriate.
Interesting. James, thoughts from you on that question?
I don't have much around the issue of shared learning, but on the first point around the speed of change, I think that other than, I mean, no one knows what the speed of change will be, but there is the potential for it to be very rapid in certain areas. And I think the challenge will be for whether policymakers and regulators can keep pace with technological change. And I think that was my only thought, really, just in terms of how that may play out. But it's never possible to predict how the technologies will really, and how rapid that will be.
Maybe a quick follow-up question to you on that, and then also to our other panelists. Just very briefly, we're almost running out of time, I'm seeing, but do you feel like from your interviews that there is an awareness among the regulators and policymakers that you've spoken with that, first of all, of that large degree of uncertainty and the possibly or potentially or even probably very rapid changes that they are facing over the next years and decades? Is there that anticipation and that awareness that this might be happening?
I think there's definitely awareness, but I don't think it's anticipation as much as concern about it. And there are examples in my research of, initiatives that are coming forward that don't fit within the regulatory framework, that are attempting to drive down emissions in one way or another and causing tension between policymakers and regulators. And I think my sense was the regulators are really looking to the policymakers to say, come on here, let's really kind of open this up and look at how we're going to bring this forward. And that wasn't perhaps happening as much as it might at the moment.
Robert, Patricia, brief comments on that question before I turn to our final round of comments.
I guess there's always the question of resources and capacity and how some of these organizations will have to build up maybe to try to get a couple of steps ahead instead of always feeling like they're behind.
Right.
Yeah,
great.
Maybe sorry, Marisa. Yeah, we'll just add to that because I think that's a really good point. That in terms of getting to net zero, we're talking about a massive scale up, right? Like we're asking essentially investors and the private sector to go forward and do this. We have to scale up institutions like our regulatory institutions at the same time. Otherwise, we're going to just create a tremendous amount of frustration going forward. But that's not a regulator decision. That's a government decision to provide that funding and that support.
Great. I see lots more questions coming in, and I'm very sorry that we didn't get to more of them. But just to close off the session, I wanted to have a kind of quick round. Every speaker, 10 to 15 seconds to reply. We've discussed a lot of challenges and imperatives for regulators / governments in today's session. If you each could just tell me one thing that you feel like could be implemented relatively soon to make a change, to actually come a bit closer to a solution of these challenges and imperatives. Robert, let's start with you. One measure that you can say this could make a real difference relatively soon.
I come back to the question of policy clarity and certainty. At the end of the day, I have tremendous confidence in the ability of a group of stakeholders to come together and find a solution to an issue if they agree on the problem. And I don't think we agree on the problem enough.
Patricia.
I think a lot more of these formal agreements would help within a jurisdiction and across jurisdictions. They were actually a bit hard to find.
Great. James.
I think it's just the point we touched on just before this, that I think there needs to be much more active discussion between all the energy decision makers at the different levels of government, municipal, provincial, and regulators and utilities need to come together and really work up a plan, I think.
Great. Thank you. I'm mindful of time, so it's my pleasure to close today's session. I would like to thank our speakers today, including the regulatory leaders, Susanna Sagar, Cynthia Chaplin, and Peter Gurnham, who we heard in the video remarks earlier. We would also like to thank the Positive Energy funders who make our research and engagement possible. Positive Energy has a wide range of funders, policymakers, including NRCan, Alberta, Canada, regulators, the BC Utilities Commission, BC Oil and Gas Commission, Alberta Energy Regulator, industry associations, Canadian Renewable Energy Association, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and the Canadian Electricity Association. Also individual companies like Ovintiv and Synovus, Innovation Networks, the Clean Research and Innovation Network. Tri-Council funding was provided by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. In addition, I'd like to thank the Positive Energy team members, Brendan Frank and Raphael Desardi, for working with me to plan and organize this conference. Brendan and Raphael, we could not have done it without you. And finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for participation in this week's sessions. All of the studies discussed over the last few days are already available on the Positive Energy website or will be available shortly. Video recordings of all sessions, along with the presentations, are also available on our website, and we encourage you to share them through your networks. And feel free to reach out at any time if you would like to discuss public confidence and energy decision-making with us. This concludes the final session of our virtual conference this year. Thank you so much for being here with us.